when this beginner defeated Magnus Carlsen. For those of you who know Magnus Carlsen, you know him for one thing, and that's his incredible skills on the chessboard. Throughout his career, the former world chess champion has played several people from all walks of life, some extremely talented and others amateur. But even though he is a badass in the world of chess, giving each of his competitors a clean win, he suffered a terrible defeat in the hands of a beginner. This was not only an embarrassment, but a costly mistake for a world champion to make. In the lead-up to this incredible late-night bar match in Oslo, Norway, Magnus was not in fine form, and even top chess players expressed concern over his performance, questioning his dwindling success on the chessboard. He had just narrowly prevailed over his childhood rival and fellow chess champion Sergei Karjakin in the World Chess Championship. But being a world chess champion and having achieved incredible feats on the chessboard, it was almost impossible that a beginner will shine over Magnus. And when the stage was set for Magnus to play against the armature, tension seemed to building up from one move to the next. Magnus, who was in control of the white pieces, started the match with an immediate e4, and the opponent was quick to respond with an e5. This would eventually transition the match to a typical Spanish opening, considering that the knights had already been linked and c3 being played. The audience could not help but cheer up the two players as they tackled each other. The excitement rose even more when the armature moved his pawn to square e6, subsequently eliminating Magnus's bishop from the board. The two continued to tackle each other mentally on the board with much success until Magnus's opponent messed up with the knight on position g6. This blunder allowed Magnus to gain control of the center after the knight on position c3. Now, this was the moment Magnus became overambitious. Looking at his body language and the way he executed his moves, you could tell he was already overconfident in the match. But his opponent took advantage of his speedy moves to carefully study his moves and think through them before responding. It looked a bit weird, especially considering that the opponent was already in a vulnerable position. But eventually, this tactic would end up saving the armature, as you'll see later in this video. Magnus had already secured a competitive advantage against his opponent, thanks to the strategic placement of his pawns right at the center of the chessboard. It all seems like his opponent is losing out completely. Magnus now has one goal in mind, and that's to launch an attack on his opponent's bishop. He carefully takes advantage of his opponent's vulnerability to launch an attack on king's side, putting him in the right position to capture his opponent's bishop. Guys, you know if things are going to continue this way, you can be sure Magnus has the victory. But before things get thick, his opponent immediately realizes that he just messed up. Magnus is now quickly attacking his knights, but the opponent is retreating fast. Despite the retreat, Magnus maintains the attack on the opponent knights. It's now clear to the opponent that Magnus' pawn's attack may end up eliminating his bishop, which would eventually result in losing a piece. With no other option left, the opponent is forced to sacrifice his bishop by capturing the pawn to save him from losing the game. With the bishop eliminated on either side, Magnus now plays 6 and inaccuracy. At this point, things are not looking well for him. In response, his opponent plays queen e5, which ends up threatening a scary mate on the h2 square. Magnus attacks with queen h5, but then again, this is another mistake since it has no threat to mate. On realizing this mistake, Magnus takes the pawn with g7, placing his opponent in a vulnerable position. The game is quickly coming to an end, and the tension is rising. The opponent is aware of the threat, but he remains committed to playing till the end by moving his rook out of harm's way. In an unexpected mistake, Magnus plays his cards poorly, losing the game entirely and eventually resigning. He had just received a terrible defeat from a beginner. To bring this to an end, you got to realize that even the best players in the world of chess can still make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes can be costly, just like Magnus Carlsen tasted defeat in the hands of an armature. So never be overconfident in your chess mastery. Despite that, Magnus Carlsen is still one of the best chess players in the world.